All right, we are back for our Church History 101. We are on chapter 2, the beginning. So I will call this chapter 2A, and we are going to be talking about the medieval church. So this has the time frame of being roughly AD 500 to 1500. Let me just take a super quick aside and make a trivial point. Though it's fallen out of fashion to describe years as AD or BC, you see a lot CE, the Christian era, or sometimes the Common Era, and yeah, whatever, knock yourself out. We all know why we picked the year to start at one that we did. So call it whatever you feel like. BC does mean before Christ, and so it's properly put after the year. So 500 BC, 500 years before Christ. AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, is properly placed in front. So you would say AD 500, the year of our Lord, 500. So anyway, that is the range in which we're talking about. And 1,000 years, yeah, why not take 10 pages to talk about 1,000 years? We can knock that out. And yeah, so we're obviously skipping over a lot of specifics, and we're just barely glancing at an awful lot of things that happen within that time period. So for this to be a survey class really means that that's what we're supposed to do, is we're supposed to just kind of touch on big picture kind of things and do so at a pretty surfacey level. But at the same time to try to get the gist of what is happening, and assuming that these time frames are similar, so that there's a theme maybe, or a certain element that's happening, that all of these years, these centuries even, you can kind of group together in a way that makes some sort of internal sense. So this is no longer what we would consider the early church period, after 5 centuries, 500 years. It's not new anymore after 500 years. A lot of the foundation has been poured at this point. It is no longer the patristic era, the era of the church fathers. That was happening kind of the end of that time frame prior to 500. And that's not to say that there won't be incredibly influential writers, theologians, church leaders in this time frame too, but they tend to get grouped into a different, by 500, the foundational creeds of the church have already been settled. The canon of scripture has been closed. The time of the illegal church or the persecuted church, at least in its foundational time frame, is past. And so now this is the church as it begins with a little more maturity to spread and to kind of think. So there is a very common descriptor for this period of church history, or at least this late period within this time frame we're talking about. If they don't, and this is kind of a popular use, this is no longer used in academic settings, but if it's not referred to as medieval, the medieval era, it would be kind of common to hear somebody maybe talk about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, as opposed to if we recall what comes next after the medieval period, the Renaissance, the rebirth, the Dark Ages then are, the suggestion is that's the counterbalance, like, oh, it got really bad, but then the Renaissance, oh, it got better again. It was really, really dark, and oh, the Renaissance brings in a lot of the light. And that's just not really true. So in this medieval period, I'm not going to try to argue that there wasn't a lot of the learning and discoveries and innovations of the Renaissance. I'm going to say, though, that there was not this sense of like this dark pit of time that stretched out, and then all of a sudden the Renaissance was like turning on a light bulb. The Renaissance and most of what you would think like it quote unquote recovers, it doesn't really recover. It's been preserved throughout this period, through the monks writing and copying things, through the scholastics. The Renaissance repopularizes a lot of things, and it brings a lot of things back to the forefront. But to call this time period dark, I think, is to do it a disservice, and it's to kind of unfairly categorize it in a way that just sounds really bad, when the reality was every age has its good and its bad. And if you just pick one half of it and assume that that's the only thing that happened, you'll miss a lot. So as you were reading over this first section, I'm hoping that you were not seeing like misery after misery and ignorance and all this kind of stuff, that instead we have in the considering the technological level of the world at this time, it is the church that is maintaining the base of knowledge. It are the monks with their copying, not just of scripture, but copying of whatever old texts there are to preserve. Paper, linen, whatever they're writing on eventually will deteriorate. And so what do? You copy it again and you keep it going. And so there's this very active preservation of history and knowledge. As the Roman Empire has now faded, it really becomes the role of the church then to both maintain human wisdom and achievement throughout the Western world, but to also like further it. So that's kind of the big news of this time period, is the fall of the Roman Empire. And even that makes it sound super dramatic. And to be honest, it really wasn't. The Roman Empire, in ways that somewhat mirror the church, splits east and west. And then it just kind of declines. It just sort of becomes weak, and it becomes flabby, and it's no longer able to administrate itself and its far-flung properties like it used to. And it gets a lot of pushback from all of, that's when you start getting your history about the Goths and the Visigoths and all these people who start attacking, Huns in there somewhere, and and Rome just kind of eventually breaks into pieces. It's not so much that there is a concluding event where there's like maybe a big war and they lose and now all their territory belongs to some other empire or country. That's not really what happens, so much as it is they lose territory here and influence there, and stuff gets smaller and more difficult to keep up, and eventually things just continue to change hands. You have these tribes of people who then become more influential. So when you start hearing words about the Franks, so you've got these French, what we would consider French now, or Germanic tribes that begin to coalesce. and they begin to become more organized. In many ways, it's because of Rome, where they might have started off as antagonists of Rome. They basically learned from Rome, like, hey, you know what? Rome's not so bad in the sense of they knew how to keep things going. And they wind up, most of them, adopting a lot of the elements of Roman administration or Roman organization. So it's not just scattered tribes, but it's actually, these are real civilizations. So this time frame will be categorized by how does the world, and most especially Western society, continue after Rome is no longer the unifying factor. Well, it's going to be the church that is the unifying factor. Well, how unified is that when you've got all these various people groups and their own princes and kings and whomever? And the answer is meh, kind of. We have several pages of the chapter talking about how these competing smaller kingdoms will sometimes look to the church to settle their disputes, and sometimes try to force the church to settle their disputes. What we would consider what's our constitutional separation of church and state is, I'm not going to call it an unknown at this time. I'm just going to say it was a very, very different way of understanding the world, where separating of church and state, that's not a question that made much sense. Now, who is the proper authority, depending on the argument or the issue? That's something that's going to come up repeatedly. And I remember this coming up in seminary, and it bored me to tears, the investiture crisis. And that gets mentioned about in the middle of our section. And I'm not going to make it sound super exciting, but it is noteworthy because of what it points to. To be invested in this sense is like to wear the vestments of your church office, your role. So to be invested as a bishop means you have the people put on your alb and a cope and the mitre, and they give you the crozier. Like, those are the symbols of your office. And when you receive them, you are invested. That is your investiture into becoming the bishop of this area or town or country, wherever it is. Well, these are roles with power, authority, responsibility, obligations. They're kind of a big deal. So who then is in charge of making new bishops? Because if a bishop dies or whatever, who is going to replace him? Who's in charge of saying this is the new bishop of this area? Because that's a very influential job. Is it the church? Okay, that makes sense. Who's the church in this regard? Is it a person? Is it a committee? Is it a group of people? Remember, this is not a time where we can go on a Zoom call and get all of the bishops to make some kind of decision. Like, you're going to walk someplace that's 3 weeks away in order to sit in a committee and then come back another 3 weeks. And, it might take a year to just get the information and decisions back and forth to whatever you're talking about. Should it be a local authority or ruler? Well, that makes sense because they're in charge of this area, or they own the land, or whatever it is. But what if they want to pick somebody that disagrees with the rest of the church? And so the investiture controversy is basically who gets the final say in naming church leadership. Is it the local leaders, the landowners, the king, or is it the church? And if it is the church, who in the church? and how? Remember that even as we were talking last time, in that late patristic era, that the church of the East and the West were separating further and further. There were increased disputes between the various heads of the churches. Who, if anyone, is the ultimate responsibility? Who's the boss there? If the various patriarchs, I am the patriarch of Alexandria, and I am the patriarch of Constantinople, and I'm the patriarch of Rome, and we are individually in charge, and nobody disputes that over everyone within this wide area, but then the 4 or 5 of us, we get together and we disagree, who splits the top or who makes the decision? And of course, Rome has said, I'll do it. And that has only furthered this sense of the East in particular feeling disenfranchised. Bless you. They grow apart. They think a little differently. They act a little differently. The Eastern Church feels much more Greek and Middle Eastern. The Western Church feels much more Latin and Roman. And then it will eventually become more German and more French. And this is before there's a Germany or a France, but these are the people groups that will eventually, found these specific nations. So they start relating to each other worse and worse. They start distrusting each other more and more, and they start making decisions without each other. Up until this point, these ecumenical councils where we've done stuff like made a creed was ostensibly everyone in the church coming together. Remember, we went to the book of Acts and we talked about the Council of Jerusalem, and that was the principle. When all of the church comes together under the authority of the Holy Spirit, we are led into all truth. And so that was a lot of the rationale for these ecumenical councils, to do the same thing that happened in the book of Acts. Well, what happens when the ecumenical council is just us over here and not you guys over there? Is it an ecumenical council anymore? So the East and the West stop going to each other's councils. Some of it is practical, and some of it is starting to get hurt feelings, and those hurt feelings becoming resentment and bitterness. Some of the decisions that are made in the West don't seem of super theological importance. The Gregorian calendar, which we take for granted, but that was an innovation of the church, Pope Gregory, where the calendar at time that was in use throughout Europe and a lot of the world was inaccurate because it was always getting messed with. When you think about the names of our months, where do they come from? January, that comes from Janus, a Roman god, right? Where does July come from? Well, Julius Caesar was such an important guy, he wanted a whole month named after himself. So they snuck in another month. I mean, the calendar starts to grow. It wasn't initially 12 months, it was much fewer. His successor, his nephew, Octavian, becomes the first true emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus, and says, well, I ought to have a month too. Let's call it August. And so they're shifting days and dates, and the calendar is just not accurate. As a matter of fact, a calendar, the time it takes for the Earth to revolve around the sun and get back to exactly where it started is not 365 days. And we know that just as a practical sense through what? I mean, today, how does our calendar reflect that it's not 365 days? Because every 4 years, there's a leap day. except when there isn't. Because leap years, any year that ends like in 2 zeros or something like that is automatically not a leap year. There's all sorts of little rules about this that you might not realize, because it's not even 365.25. It's actually some ridiculously long decimal. But what that means is that there was a constant shuffling. Like the astronomers of the time understood that we were losing and gaining ground in weird ways. And that's kind of a problem over the course of time. It doesn't make much of a difference in a year or two, but in 200 years, when summer is now winter, you're really messed up. So we have to reorganize this. We have to clean this up. And part of what happens is everybody basically shifts a period of time and then cleans up the calendar so it's now consistent and everyone's kind of in agreement. And that's, 30 days. Several have 31, February 20, but like it's standardized. It's not so willy-nilly anymore. The East didn't agree to that. The East was ticked because they basically said, how dare you do that without us? We're not going to do it. So, and for nearly a millennia, the East stayed on what is referred to as the Julian calendar. To this day, Orthodox holidays are calculated differently, and they're usually about a week or so apart. They are both calculated off of a different calendar, but they're also calculated with a slightly different system. An older system that the East never changed. The West did, the East didn't. That's why you're like, oh, we have, Easter, hooray. And then like, oh, Orthodox Easter is next week or something like that. My friend, the Orthodox Archbishop down in South Florida, he was very amused by the whole thing, because even in Orthodoxy they can't get along, and so some of them were called old calendarists who critiqued the new calendarists, and the new calendarists thought the old calendarists were stupid, and on and on and on and on. And that's just to say, the church as a whole is suffering the same thing that we see in all of humanity, which is in our imperfect nature, our inability to always get along and to always maintain without making mistakes, without losing out, without doing wrong, so on and so forth. So East and West, theologically, in very practical ways, start drifting further and further apart. Instead of being brothers, they become more like cousins. And the longer that goes, the more distinct they become. My sister's grandchildren all live in the same area. I mean, just like a few houses away from each other, and they're all roughly the same age. There's a bunch of them. And there's 3 of them in particular who were all born the same year. And they're like little peas in a pod when they play, and when they argue, and when they fight, and all this kind of stuff. But they're being basically raised together. I had cousins that I saw twice a year. They didn't live all that far. They live in Gainesville. But 2 of them were like more than 5 years older than me. And one was like 8 years younger. And we saw each other a couple of times a year. Now, how similarly were we raised? There's definitely some overlap, but also plenty of distinctions. Now imagine about, I've got these cousins and whatever. What about now our children? They're first cousins, and they basically never see each other. How similar are they? What ways have they've been raised the same or different? And so as the generations go on, these changes really solidify. So we are moving towards a schism. Schism means a break. The Great Schism of 1054 is attributable to the excommunication by the Pope of the, I think the Patriarch of Constantinople. I think that's what it was. But it really just formalizes a split that was already true. We could say that those were the divorce papers in a marriage where they hadn't lived together for the past couple of years. It made it formal and official, but they hadn't been together in a long time. Does that make sense? So this is the era in which we're talking about. We are talking about a time where the church is now split east and west and are basically growing separately from each other. And there's just not a ton of interaction between the two sides. The church continues to spread, but now in the West, it's spreading north and to the west, all the way through continental Europe into the British Isles, down into Africa and the East. It's also spreading down into Africa, up into Eastern Europe, spreading through Russia. That entire area from the Middle East eastward. And those are just very different cultures. So I'm going to say there's three principal things that are happening here. And under those three things, there's like a million little details and reasons why. But the big ones are the decline and end of the Roman Empire as a unifying factor, the practical and then formal split of the church between East and West, and then a third factor, which is the creation and rise of Islam. Those are going to be your three kind of principal issues within this time frame. So again, because Rome has declined, something's going to have to take the vacuum, fill that vacuum. And what fills the vacuum are these smaller, states, kingdoms, principalities, the tribes which have now coalesced into something more substantial than a tribe. The Franks, and they found Francia. And so you've got these areas that are now all united and connected through sort of a hereditary ownership of land. There's a really interesting point, and I'm trying to remember if it's in this book or not, but money almost disappears during this time frame. And that seems like an odd thing to think about. Before, there was a lot of commerce that was happening even within the ancient world. As a matter of fact, one of the very famous sayings of Jesus, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, comes from what? A coin. Look at this coin. I'm going to tell you a story because you have one and you understand, you pay your taxes and all this kind of stuff. Well, that was a lot easier to do when you've got a single unifying empire. And even if you're trading with other smaller countries or empires, with Rome in charge, you've got a mint, you've got a coinage, you've got, it seems kind of self-evident, except it's not. Because when that breaks apart and you've got these smaller areas, there's less and less currency around. That doesn't mean there's not wealth, but now the wealth for the biggest issue is going to be in land. So without a lot of coinage, without, this country might not have much gold. Does that mean they have nothing? Well, no, they say, okay, what's important is the land because you still need to eat. I don't care if you have gold. I've got food. What are you going to do about it? So the land, because it can shelter and house people, but most importantly, feed them, becomes kind of the primary element of wealth. And so the more land you have, the more influence and power you have. And that's what really starts shaping these unified people groups coming together, staying together, and systematizing what is referred to as a feudal system, not futile, but feudal, has to do with basically these landowners. I own some land. I have enough land for people to work on, but not enough land for me to be completely self-sufficient if somebody bigger and stronger came after me. So what do? I align myself with somebody who has more land, more people, and I say, if you will protect me when I'm in a jam, I will help you when you call, and I'll send you a little something come harvest time. Well, that bigger landowner does the same thing. It's like a pyramid scheme with another bigger landowner, with a bigger land. So you've got like maybe a king on top, for instance. And everybody's paying a little something to the king. And he says, well, basically, this is all my land, but I'm going to let you use it. And then underneath him, you might have, you know, some feudal lord, a duke or a baron or whatever, and they own quite a bit. And they pay tribute to the king, but they expect the people who are underneath him to pay tribute to him. You keep working downward until you get to a very kind of low-level lord who just might have his, you know, enough land for a few people to work on. Those people, though, who are doing all the work, how much land do they own? Nothing. What will eventually grow into the concept of the serf? These are people, peasants, who don't have land of their own, but they still need to eat, so they work the land that belongs to someone else. What we might even consider as like a sharecropper, but you have a relationship with your lord upwards to say, I'm going to live here on your property, and I'm going to work your property, and I'm going to give you a percentage. I'm going to keep a percentage. And if the robbers and bandits want to come and steal my cabbage, you're going to protect me. But I also agree that if another lord starts marching up against you with an army, you might call me up and I'll serve in your army. And so this is very interdependent, interrelated sort of system that in many ways is just trying to fill the gap that happens because there's no giant empire that is running everything with the efficiency of Rome. So when we talked before about the investiture crisis and who gets to say who is the bishop of this area, understand that that's the context it's happening in. Like if you're in the area and you're the feudal lord of the area, you own all this stuff. And Rome is not just thousands of miles away, it might be months of travel away. And we don't even know that if we sent word that we need a new bishop, we'd ever get any answer back. How are you even going to know who to pick? You don't live anywhere near here. So some of these issues start off in a very practical way, but they have some substantial consequences. Because remember, we're talking about wealth being connected to land and property. Well, the church owns land and property. The church building, but churches aren't just a building. They typically have a big stretch of property as well. And churches, just like a feudal lord, would have that property worked on for income, for food. So if you are basically able to name a local feudal lord in the position of an abbot or a bishop, both the local lords and the church as a whole have a big interest in who that is. And so there's going to be continual conflicts. And some of them will go quite high. The church will lend its support to some lords over others. And then those lords, depending on how powerful they get, either support the church because they're thankful, or they strong arm the church because now they're strong enough to do it. This will result in a few times in church history where you had an out and out conflict between some very high level king and, say, the Pope. One of which is mentioned within our chapter, and they basically the Holy Roman Emperor, and he submits himself to the Pope and asks for forgiveness, and the Pope asks to forgive him because you're the Pope. But it basically falls back on the authority is in the church to do this. But in a funny way, I'm reminded of something. I think this is attributed to Stalin. But somebody was warning Stalin about like not crossing the Pope, like the influence of the church. And Stalin made some sort of comment like, "Tell me, how many army divisions does the Pope have?" And there is a practical reality in that statement that reflects all the way back into this medieval time period. You know, the church can say what it wants to say. Does it have the power to carry it out? The church can pick a side, but if the side it picks is too weak and loses in a war, doesn't matter what the church does. And you can say, well, the church doesn't have armies and swords and stuff like that. So ultimately, they don't have enough power. They don't have enough authority to tell me what to do. But then again, Stalin is long dead. And the country he ran as a dictator is gone too. And the church still remains. The power that the church wields is sometimes beyond just a numerical number of swords. So that is being, kind of tested and jockeyed throughout this time frame, as the world is in just a lot of transition. This feudal system is very complicated, but it's also kind of fragile. These are not clear, clean, strong borders of a nation that you might see, a couple of hundred years later. These are more, they start shifting. And, one minor lord who's connected to a bigger lord maybe changes sides or gets killed and is replaced by somebody who's no longer, aligned to, the lines change and the allegiances shift. And even the sense of are we a united group or not is, these are things that are being worked out over the course of centuries. This is also a time frame. This is the time frame forever, but worked out in the ways that we've been talking about. This is time immemorial, the crisis of God's people, of upon receiving God's grace are disobedient. And then there are consequences of that disobedience. And then there's repentance. And in the repentance, there's forgiveness and grace. And then after the reception of grace, there's disobedience. And you read the Old Testament, and it's like up and down and up and down and up and down. And that's the church at this time as well. Up and down and up and down and up and down. As a distinction from a lot of this sense of the worldly power and the land ownership and who has all of the influence and all that kind of stuff, you see this really explosive rise of monastic communities and the monastic vows. These are people who have basically tried to cut themselves out of the rat race of church and state and power and influence and everything else, to say, we wish to lead these pious, holy lives under this particular discipline of, say, service or scriptural study or prayer or service to the poor, becoming poor ourselves. people like St. Francis of Assisi, this is the time frame in which he is coming, a young man who is coming out of wealth and really turning his back on all of that to say, this is not how God has intended me to worship him, but instead to be out free of these material possessions and all of this back and forth and argument and fighting and trying to grab more and more, and in humble service to the very least of those who are around. But it's not just Francis, obviously, there's a whole list. And the monastic orders that we might recognize by name today, most of them have their start here from a person that they are named after. So if we think of the Franciscans, well, that comes from Francis. And eventually there is a Francis, and that's in this time period. The Dominicans, there was a Dominic. The Benedictines, there was a Benedict. So on and so forth. So between the service of the monastics, however, and the church as the kind of last vestige of a unifying whole, we still have the preservation of scholarship. Again, a lot through the copying of things, but it's not just the rote copying of what has gone on before. There is real thought, heavy lifting happening. This is not so much what is the fundamental nature of Christianity? What do these things mean that happened during the patristic period? This is more that next level of now breaking that further down to say, well, what are the implications of this? So the scholastic period for, in schools and the scholars and the scholarship is this time frame kind of described here, where a lot of the knowledge that is both being preserved and it's being promoted is happening through these particular schools, where there is a lot of emphasis on wrestling with the philosophical implications of doctrine and faith. And we have some enormous intellects and writers of enormous influence, people like Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, Bonaventure, who wrote about the faith in a way that we still wrestle with today. When we want to think in mature ways about the implication of our faith, there are things that some of those writers and thinkers have written that have still yet to be surpassed. And any thinker today would be well served by wrestling with them first. So the scriptural mandate to love the Lord thy God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength continues on with a lot of their work, where they are no longer just writing the basics of the faith, what it means, or just writing an apology to explain the faith in an evangelistic fashion. But now that those basics have been just kind of assumed and presumed by everybody, well, now let's dig deeper. What is the implication of saying these things to your life? How should that actually look? What happens when these two details bump up against each other? How do we know? What do we do? And so that's where you get a lot of these works that are just so in depth in digging into what might feel like the minutia, but it is to say they were not satisfied with simply skating on the surface of an issue. They wanted to know why. They wanted to understand the reason and the rationale behind. That was honorable to God, to not just take the easy way out, but to really wrestle with the intellectual and philosophical implications of some of the things that people were bringing up. The excesses of this where it was often accused, and the phrase I believe appears in the chapter about how many angels dance in the head of a pin, is really just a kind of a snotty critique of saying, well, there's a way to think so deeply about the details that you miss the forest for the trees. And that is a real possibility, and that is a real risk. You can both think too surfacey about an issue, and you can think too deeply about it. And both of those, left at their extremes, are often counterproductive. If you have a very simplistic answer to everything, you may be unprepared to deal with a real life complexity. But if you think about any one issue, but on one hand, but on the other hand, but on the other hand, but on the other hand, you're like, you can get frozen in action because you can always think about something just a little bit more. So, there's the nice mix isn't always present, but it ought to be. All right. So that's going to bring us to kind of the last major element of this. These are things that are shaping the time frame, not so much the individual acts or individual people, but just kind of the bigger issues. And that's the rise of Islam. So Islam, which begins in the 7th century with the life and death of Muhammad in the Middle East, is a aggressively evangelistic faith. It evangelizes, and this is by the encouragement and direction of Muhammad himself, by the sword. So you are to bring the faith by force. The way that you bring people into Islam is you conquer. That was evident within the life of Muhammad. It's evident within the Quran itself, and it is evident the first 3 centuries, 2-3 centuries of Islam is an incredibly aggressive expansion, but it's military. We are going to bring the truth of Allah, but we are going to do it by conquering you, and then you will obey. Islam, which is an Arabic word which means submission, and it means primarily submission to Allah, to God. But the way that it operates is it spreads like fire across all of these various lands, starting in the Middle East, and it runs fast. It burns hot, deep into Africa, far west into Europe. There were multiple times where between a battle or two, there would be no Western Europe as we understand it. It would have all been conquered and under a caliphate. And you can pick out specific battles. Tours is referenced in this one, but that's not going to be the only one. We're going to get, multiple ones. Jan Sobieski riding with his Polish hussars at the gates of Vienna to break the siege. I mean, that happens in like the 1600s. And so, these are things that there are times like this where Islam might have taken all of Europe. And it takes specific, counteracting armies and leaders and events to stop that from happening. It does spread and land as far outward as Spain. The Moors of Spain. This is the Islamic conquest and the holding of Spain for basically 300 years. Not until the 1400s are the last Moors expelled from Spain. Like, if you think of Islam and you think of like, oh, Saudi Arabia and all that kind of stuff. How about Madrid? That's how far and deep into Europe it had gotten. Deep into Africa as well. So there is now an antagonist to that the church is the unifying factor. Well, now what happens when you're not just trying to keep these feudal lords and vassals and stuff cooperating and together, you now have an existential threat in the armies of a caliphate that wish to conquer all of you and have you submit to Islam, and in doing so, rejecting Christ. So there's both this sort of a working out of how these are the stakes right now, and this is what it means for us we have to unify or else. But when you think geographically about the Middle East being taken over, and then this dropping south and into Africa and kind of skirting the bottom of Europe and having these sharp, points trying to push into all the rest of Western Europe, you now have a physical barrier between the Western church and the Eastern church. Now it's not just so much like cousins who don't talk to each other. Walls have now been built where you can't even get together if you wanted to. The other thing that's going to happen is within the Islamic world, there's going to be a lot of trade. There's a lot of exchange happening between not just the goods and services of all the various areas that are falling under control, but also the renewal of some of the thoughts, especially the Greek philosophers are coming back up again because they take over Greece. And so, we're resurrecting a lot of these guys, and Aristotle was pretty awesome. We're going to talk about him again. So within this kind of Islamic world or Islamic influence, a lot of these ideas are, and the trade is bubbling up. But the Western church isn't benefiting much from this right now. Because remember, Islam is an antagonist. They're not a cooperative trade partner. As a matter of fact, a lot of the trade that was happening earlier on is cut off. And it's only through the things like the Crusades, when they succeed and when they fail, that basically reestablish some trade lines that Western Europe either had never experienced or had lost over the years. So we now have the scholastics are starting to get that Aristotelian thought again, like I mentioned. The spices of the Near and Far East are starting to be imported again, which they had been absent for so long. And a lot of these things, the good and the bad, are going to be kind of directly related to Islamic control over specific portions of the world. All right, so those are going to be, our three kind of major themes. And all the stuff that we've been reading about within this particular section are going to kind of fall under one of those three, and it's sometimes more than one. But the individual issues, the individual people, the individual moments and things are really going to be kind of interrelated to the state of the world at that time. And that's kind of the state of the world. There is no Rome. The church is the best chance for unity. Islam, what was the other one? I had it together in my head a minute ago. East and West split. I think that was it. So anyway, and that's kind of where we are. Okay, so anything from the section? Any of the little stories or something pop out?
Tells me how much I have missed along the way.
So there's actually some really cool stories in here, and you could almost take one and do a whole, like, let's talk about Charlemagne. he
Yeah.
pops up here because remember, there is no Rome, only the church, and the East and West split, and Islam. Well, whose life becomes this like symbol of dealing with all three problems at the same time? Charlemagne. You got these people who pop up, Charles Martel, and Charlemagne is his grandson, I think. Um, Frankish king, there is no Rome, only the church, works with the church and the Pope to both gain influence and to protect the church. East and West split, maybe not quite so much, but then Islam, he fights back, and I think it was Charles Martel fighting in the Battle of Tours that stops that initial spread of Islam that might have just run roughshod over Europe as a whole. And it'll be Charlemagne who will eventually be crowned as the first Holy Roman Emperor. That there's a joke, in the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman, because it's basically French and German. It's kind of what we would consider eventually becoming kind of what grows into France and Germany. And the holy part is really kind of a thanks from the church for both saving our bacon and being the best chance as a unifying power that will stand with us and support us. The church says, yeah. Hey, remember that empire that we all kind of miss? Well, it has been reborn in you. You are the one. You are the chosen one. So that's kind of, and that's where this grows out of. And we could take, a bunch of these various stories and go with, into some depth with them. But again, this is trying to give us a sense of, as we read the stories, understanding the context in which they're happening is sometimes the reason why they're happening at all. The reason why there is a Charles Martel or a Charlemagne is because no Roman Empire as a unifying factor, church is the only hope, and Islam. So these are, cometh the hour, cometh the man, and these are some of the issues that will pop up during this time.
But Charlemagne stopped the Islamic push.
Yeah.
Right? So therefore, he does kind of stand for the church.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, so his grandfather Charles Martel is kind of the first one, because this is in the earlier portion where it looks like Islam might have that initial burst and just take everybody out. And Charles Martel, Battle of Tours, and this is where that first stop happens, and then develops a relationship with the church. And then he wants the same papal authority that was given to him in Thanksgiving to then pass on to his sons. There's kind of are we going to do that or not? This is where you get like Pepin the Short and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes I lose track of names, but then his son is Charlemagne. And a Charlemagne who was able to reorganize and reaffirm everything that his grandfather started, and then takes on the next generation of Islamic expansion and stops it.
What nationality was Charles Martel?
There is no nationality at this point. He is a Frankish king.
Okay.
And so these are within that kind of wide continental Western Europe. There are various people groups, and as they start to coalesce, Francia kind of covers a pretty wide swath into what will eventually be France and eventually become Germany.
What stopped it from the other end for the Greek Orthodox? Who stopped it for them?
So to some degree, it wasn't stopped. Unfortunately, our book really glosses over the East quite a bit. What develops in what will eventually be referred to as the Byzantine Empire begins to coalesce now with the Eastern the remnant of Rome, like the Roman Empire. The Byzantines said Rome never fell. We are Rome. That's us. Those guys in the West around the city of Rome, the West, they might have fallen. We are the heirs of the true Rome, and we never fell. So the Byzantine Empire kind of hunkers down and they fight off Islam quite a bit, but they also lose substantial ground, such as all of the Holy Land. The Crusades, which will be fought over this time period, are basically trying to most of them regain the Holy Land, which had been conquered. So in the East, the Byzantine Empire was basically the remnants of old Rome, and it maintained itself for quite some time. It was never as strong as Rome. It was never as expansionist as Rome used to be, but it was pretty stable and solid. And its relationship with the Eastern churches were, just kind of hand in glove. But that is, and it's its own history. Anything else? Okay, well, it feels like we've taken, this is 1,000 years, and I feel like we've talked about almost nothing. But we're going to do the second half, and I think it's going to be a little bit more, not practical, but like a little more hands-on or human level, looking at the life of a Christian in this time frame. And so that's hopefully going to give us another element of how to talk about this medieval period, not just in an overarching socio-political way, but also in just, kind of a more tangible, this is what the church, this is how the church lived.
Where did they get the name medieval? Where's it coming from?
It's a Latin derivation, and that's one of those things I used to know. And I would tell you the answer, but I'd be wrong.
But it has nothing to do with evil.
No, it has. That's what they refer to as a false cognate. I thought that way too. Like, oh, they were like kind of bad. Like, no. It's not evil like good and evil. That's the wrong kind of evil. It's more of a partial time frame period, not a sort of evil, sort of bad. Okay. All right. Thank you. We will do the second half next time.
Right.